Picture this, a dimly lit command room somewhere in the Middle East. Screens flicker with live satellite feeds. Red dots blink across a digital map stretching from southern Lebanon to the Red Sea. The low hum of generators mixes with urgent voices speaking in clipped tones. Then suddenly, silence. A message flashes across the screen. A ceasefire. At the exact same moment, thousands of miles away, crowds erupt. Armed fighters fire into the air. Flags rise. Chants echo through narrow streets. And then the headline hits like a shockwave. Hezbollah claims victory. The Houthis celebrate it. And Israel agrees to halt operations. Two forces, one backed by decades of military superiority, the other a network of non-state actors hardened by asymmetric warfare, face to face, blow for blow. And now, this outcome. This is not a drill. This is not speculation. This is happening right now. If you want to understand how we got here, from escalating cross-border strikes to regional proxy coordination to a ceasefire that few predicted, and what this means for the balance of power in the Middle East, global trade routes, and your everyday economic reality, then you need to see what comes next, because what you are about to hear will show you exactly why this ceasefire may not be peace at all, why multiple fronts are now interconnected in ways never seen before, and why the next 72 hours could determine whether this conflict ends or explodes into something far bigger. Welcome to Crisis Reporting. This is where we break down the most critical global conflicts, power shifts, and geopolitical flashpoints clearly, factually, and without the noise. If you want to stay ahead of stories that can reshape economies, borders, and security overnight, make sure you subscribe right now, because you do not want to be the last to know when events like this unfold in real time. Turn on notifications so you never miss a major development as it happens, because what we are covering today is not just another headline. It is a moment that could redefine the balance of power across the Middle East. Let us start with exactly what happened. On the ground, the sequence of events accelerated rapidly over a narrow window between late evening and early morning, compressing what would normally unfold over weeks into a matter of hours. According to Reuters, at approximately 22:40 local time, Israeli Defense Forces intensified aerial operations along southern Lebanon, targeting what officials described as Hezbollah command infrastructure and missile storage sites. Within minutes, multiple airstrikes were reported near Tyre and Nabateh. Lebanese state media confirmed at least 6 impact zones. By 23:15, Hezbollah responded. Rockets, not dozens, hundreds. Israeli military sources cited by CNN and ABC News confirmed that over 250 projectiles were launched in successive waves, triggering Iron Dome interceptions across northern Israel, including Haifa and the Galilee region. Sirens sounded continuously for nearly 40 minutes, but here is where it gets critical. At 00:05, the conflict expanded beyond Lebanon. The U.S. Central Command, CENTCOM, released a statement confirming that Houthi forces in Yemen launched multiple drones and anti-ship missiles toward Red Sea transit corridors. According to Al Jazeera and NBC News, at least 3 commercial vessels altered course after receiving emergency alerts. This was no longer a contained conflict. This was coordination. By 01:20, Israeli officials acknowledged multi-front pressure, a phrase that has not been used at this scale since previous regional escalations. And then came the turning point. At approximately 02:10, back-channel negotiations, reportedly mediated through Qatar and Egypt, produced a temporary ceasefire framework. According to the Wall Street Journal, the agreement included an immediate halt to Israeli strikes in southern Lebanon and a reciprocal pause in Hezbollah rocket fire. At 02:30, the ceasefire took effect. But here is what changed the narrative completely. Within minutes of the announcement, Houthi leadership publicly declared that the ceasefire represented a strategic victory for Hezbollah and the broader resistance axis. That statement, broadcast on regional networks and verified by CBS News, reframed the entire outcome, not as de-escalation, but as proof of coordinated pressure forcing Israel to pause. Now let us be precise about what this means. Israel did not surrender. Its military capabilities remain intact. But agreeing to halt operations under simultaneous pressure from both its northern border and maritime threats introduces a new operational reality. The battlefield is no longer linear. It is layered, multiple fronts, multiple actors, acting in near synchronization. And for the first time in this phase of the conflict, that coordination produced a tangible result, a ceasefire under pressure. But here is where it gets more complicated. Because while the guns have temporarily fallen silent, The underlying structure that made this escalation possible is still fully intact. The networks, the supply lines, the alliances, they have not disappeared. They have just paused. And that brings us to the part most headlines are missing, why this moment matters far more than anyone is openly saying. Now here is why this matters more than anyone is telling you. Here is why. What just happened is not just a ceasefire, it is a stress test of the entire regional balance, and the results are sending shockwaves far beyond the battlefield. Let us run the numbers slowly because this is where the severity becomes impossible to ignore. Roughly 12% of global trade passes through the Red Sea. That includes energy shipments, consumer goods, and critical supply chains linking Asia to Europe. According to data cited by the Wall Street Journal and Reuters, even a minor disruption in this corridor can increase shipping costs by 15 to 30% within days. Now connect the dots. Houthi missile launches, commercial vessels reroute, longer transit times, higher fuel costs, increased insurance premiums, rising global shipping prices. And that leads directly to something very personal: your fuel prices, your grocery bill, your cost of living. Because when shipping costs spike, those costs do not stay at sea, they move straight into the global economy. But it does not stop there. Israel's agreement to a ceasefire under simultaneous northern and maritime pressure sends a signal, whether intended or not, that multi-front coordination works. And that signal will be studied closely, not just in the Middle East, but by military planners worldwide. Event, perception, replication. If non-state actors believe coordinated pressure can force a pause from a technologically superior military, that changes deterrence calculations everywhere. Now layer in the economic side again. Israel's northern industrial zones account for a significant portion of its manufacturing output. Repeated rocket fire forces shutdowns reduce productivity, and according to Bloomberg estimates referenced by CNN, even short-term disruptions can cost millions of dollars per day. Now expand that impact regionally. Lebanon's economy, already in crisis, faces further strain from infrastructure damage and displacement. Yemen remains in humanitarian distress, and any escalation there compounds existing shortages. This is not just a military story, it is an economic chain reaction. But let us zoom in for a moment. One shipping executive, one decision, one phone call. At 01 now, as alerts spread about potential missile threats in the Red Sea, operators had to choose: continue through the corridor or reroute around the Cape of Good Hope, adding up to 10 to 14 days of travel time. That decision alone can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars per vessel. Multiply that across dozens of ships. Now you begin to see the scale. And then there is the human element. Civilians in northern Israel spending hours in shelters. Families in southern Lebanon dealing with airstrikes overnight. Workers unsure if factories will reopen tomorrow. These are not abstract consequences. They are immediate, lived realities. But here is where it gets even more serious. History. The Middle East has seen ceasefires before. Temporary pauses. Tactical resets. And in many cases, those pauses have been used not to end conflict, but to prepare for the next phase. Which brings us to the ticking clock. Because while the ceasefire is in place, no one has dismantled the infrastructure behind the escalation. No one has resolved the underlying tensions. No one has changed the strategic objectives of the actors involved. Time is not on their side. And if this ceasefire is interpreted not as de-escalation but as proof of concept for coordinated pressure, then what we are looking at is not the end of a confrontation. It is a preview of something far more complex, far more synchronized, and far more difficult to contain. And that brings us to the dimension of this story that almost no one is talking about, and it could change everything. Before we go any further, if you are getting value from this breakdown and want clear, fact-based analysis of stories that directly impact global stability in your daily life, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. We are covering this story in real time, and developments are moving fast. You do not want to miss what happens next. Now let us talk about the dimension of this story that most coverage is not paying attention to. Here is the dimension of this story that most coverage is not paying attention to, and it could be the most important factor of all. This is not just about Hezbollah. This is not just about Israel. This is about coordinated pressure architecture across an entire region. What most analysts are missing is this. The events you just heard about were not isolated reactions. They were synchronized signals. Everything we told you in the first part is true. But here is what makes it more complicated than it first appears. The timing. Hezbollah rocket barrages, Houthi drone and missile launches, maritime disruption warnings, all within a tightly compressed window. That is not coincidence. That is calibration. Most Western coverage treats these as parallel escalations, different groups acting independently under similar conditions. But that assumption ignores a deeper reality that regional intelligence circles have been tracking for years: the gradual alignment of non-state actors into a loosely coordinated network, not centralized, not formally unified, but aligned in objective messaging and timing. This is not just about firepower, this is about synchronization. Now let us zoom in for a moment to one room, one decision, one signal. When the ceasefire was announced, the Houthis did not simply acknowledge it. They framed it. They declared it a victory, not just for Hezbollah, but for what they called the resistance axis. That language matters, because it signals narrative coordination. And narrative in modern conflict is as important as missiles. If multiple actors can create the perception that coordinated pressure forces concessions, that perception becomes a strategic tool. It recruits support, it boosts morale, it shapes future behavior. And here is the twist. The actual battlefield outcome may be ambiguous. Militarily, Israel retains overwhelming capability, but perception does not wait for full analysis. It spreads instantly, and perception, once established, is extremely difficult to reverse. Now add historical context. Over the past 2 decades, asymmetric groups have evolved. They have studied conventional militaries. They have adapted tactics. They have moved from isolated insurgencies to networked operations, sharing intelligence methods, communication strategies, and timing approaches. We saw early versions of this in Iraq, then in Syria, then in Yemen. But what we are seeing now is something more advanced: simultaneity, pressure applied across multiple domains, land, air, and sea, within a coordinated time frame designed to stretch response capacity. This is not about defeating a military outright. This is about overwhelming decision cycles, forcing leadership into rapid, high-stakes choices under pressure from multiple directions. And that brings us to something even more critical: decision fatigue. When multiple fronts activate at once, even the most advanced military faces constraints, not in capability, but in bandwidth. How quickly can you respond? Where do you prioritize? Which threat is immediate and which can wait? Those are the questions that define outcomes in modern conflict. Now imagine this model scaled: more actors, more fronts, more synchronized timing. This is what most coverage ignores, because it challenges a core assumption that superior military technology guarantees control of escalation. But what if escalation is no longer controlled by one actor? What if it is distributed? And here is where it gets uncomfortable. If this model proves effective, even temporarily, it will not remain confined to one region. It will be studied, replicated, and adapted. That is how strategic shifts happen, not through single battles, but through demonstrated patterns. And right now, a pattern is emerging. But here is the question that should be keeping policymakers awake. Was this a one-time coordination, or a preview of a repeatable system? Because if it is repeatable, then the next phase of this conflict and others like it will not look like anything we have seen before. And that brings us to what this actually looks like on the ground, because the military reality is just as complex as the strategic one. Now let us talk about what this actually looks like on the ground, because behind the headlines, behind the ceasefire language, there is a very real, very complex military picture unfolding across multiple theaters. Start in northern Israel. The Israeli Defense Forces deployed layered air defense systems, including Iron Dome for short-range interception, David's Sling for medium-range threats, and Arrow systems for ballistic missile defense. According to CNN and ABC News, Iron Dome intercepted a significant percentage of incoming rockets, but not all. And that matters, because Hezbollah is not relying on precision. It is relying on volume. Estimates from Reuters suggest Hezbollah possesses over 100,000 rockets and missiles, ranging from short-range Katyusha rockets to more advanced guided systems. The strategy is simple: saturation. Overwhelm defenses by firing in large numbers, forcing interception systems to prioritize and inevitably allowing some projectiles through. Now move to Lebanon. Hezbollah operates through decentralized units embedded within civilian areas, using mobile launch platforms that can be deployed and relocated quickly. This is classic asymmetric warfare. Avoid direct confrontation, maximize survivability, and exploit terrain. But here is where it gets more advanced. Hezbollah has increasingly incorporated precision-guided munitions into its arsenal. These are not just random rockets. Some are capable of targeting specific infrastructure, air bases, ports, energy facilities. That changes the risk calculation entirely. Now shift south, to the Red Sea. According to CENTCOM statements and coverage by NBC News, Houthi forces launched a combination of one-way attack drones and anti-ship cruise missiles. These are not improvised weapons. Many are believed to be derived from or inspired by Iranian designs, capable of targeting vessels at significant distances. And here is the key detail: shipping lanes are narrow. That means even a small number of threats can create disproportionate disruption. You do not need to hit every ship. You just need to create enough risk that insurers raise premiums and operators reroute. Now bring in the United States. U.S. naval assets in the region, including guided missile destroyers, have been tasked with intercepting aerial threats and protecting commercial shipping. These ships are equipped with advanced radar systems and interceptor missiles, capable of tracking and neutralizing incoming threats. But even here, there is a limit. Interceptors are not infinite. Each engagement costs resources. Each deployment stretches readiness. And this is where asymmetric strategy meets conventional power. One side spends millions on advanced systems. The other deploys relatively low-cost drones and rockets in high volume. Cost imbalance, resource strain, strategic pressure. Now let us zoom in again. One radar operator, one incoming blip. Seconds to decide, is it a real threat or a decoy? Engage or hold fire. That is the reality of modern warfare. Fast, uncertain, relentless. And then there is geography. Israel is dealing with threats on its northern border. Maritime routes are under pressure to the south. That creates a multi-axis challenge. Forces must be distributed, attention divided, response times compressed. This is not a single battlefield. It is a network of battlefields. And that brings us to the worst-case scenario, the one that keeps military planners awake: simultaneous escalation. Imagine this: a renewed barrage from Hezbollah in the north, increased drone and missile activity in the Red Sea, and additional actors entering the equation, whether directly or indirectly, multiple fronts, sustained pressure, limited recovery time. In that scenario, the objective is not outright victory. It is attrition, wearing down systems, forcing difficult choices, testing limits. And if those limits are reached, even temporarily, the consequences could cascade rapidly, because once escalation crosses a certain threshold, controlling it becomes exponentially harder. And that brings us to the bigger picture, because there is another player watching all of this very closely, and their stakes may be higher than anyone realizes. Let us pull the camera back, because there is a second player whose stakes may ultimately exceed everyone else. And that player is China. Here is the number that changes everything. Over 40% of China's total trade with Europe passes through the Red Sea corridor and the Suez Canal. According to data cited by Bloomberg and the Wall Street Journal, that translates into hundreds of billions of dollars in annual trade volume moving through a single, vulnerable choke point. Now connect that to what just happened: Houthi missile threats, shipping disruption, rerouting, delays, increased costs. For China, this is not a distant geopolitical issue. This is a direct economic pressure point, because China's growth model depends heavily on export stability, manufactured goods moving efficiently to European markets, energy imports moving reliably through maritime routes. Any disruption in that chain creates friction, cost increases, delivery delays, contractual penalties. Now here is where the contradiction emerges. China has positioned itself as a stabilizing force in global trade. It has invested heavily in infrastructure through the Belt and Road Initiative, including ports and logistics hubs connected to these very routes. What China wants is stability, predictability, open corridors. But what it is getting is volatility, and that puts Beijing in a difficult position. On one hand, it has strategic relationships across the region, including economic ties with countries connected to the actors involved. On the other hand, prolonged instability directly threatens its economic interests. This is not a simple choice. Apply pressure and risk entanglement. Stay neutral and absorb economic damage. Now let us run one more number. Insurance premiums for vessels transiting high-risk zones can increase by up to 50% during periods of heightened threat, according to maritime risk assessments referenced by Reuters. Multiply that across China's shipping volume, and you are looking at significant cost escalation. And again, those costs do not stay isolated. They ripple outward into global markets, into supply chains, into pricing structures. But here is the deeper issue: global order. For decades, the assumption has been that major powers, particularly those with significant economic stakes, will act to stabilize key trade routes. But what happens when the sources of disruption are decentralized, non-state actors operating across multiple regions? Traditional leverage becomes less effective. You cannot negotiate in the same way. You cannot deter in the same way. And that leaves major powers reacting, rather than shaping outcomes. Now consider the long-term implication. If key maritime corridors become persistently unstable, global trade patterns may begin to shift. Alternative routes, regionalization of supply chains, increased costs built into the system. That is not a short-term disruption. That is structural change. And China is at the center of that equation. But here is the question. Can China influence events enough to protect its interests without becoming directly involved? Or will it be forced into a more active role as pressure builds? Because if Beijing moves, even diplomatically, it could alter the trajectory of this situation in ways that are not immediately visible. And that brings us to the moment where all of these threads converge, because what happens next will determine whether this remains contained or escalates beyond control. This is where all the threads converge. We are now entering the most critical phase of this entire situation, the window where outcomes are not yet locked in, but the direction is about to be decided. And there are only two realistic paths forward. Scenario A, escalation. The ceasefire holds briefly, then breaks. A single miscalculation, a stray rocket, a retaliatory strike, and within hours, the fragile pause collapses. Hezbollah resumes high-volume rocket fire. Israel responds with expanded air and ground operations deeper into southern Lebanon. At the same time, Houthi forces intensify attacks in the Red Sea, increasing the frequency and range of drone and missile launches. Now add pressure from multiple directions. Shipping disruptions worsen. Insurance costs spike further. Global markets react. Energy prices begin to climb. And here is where it accelerates. Additional actors, directly or indirectly, become involved. Support flows increase. Intelligence sharing expands. The conflict zone widens, not necessarily through formal declarations, but through layered participation. This is not a contained escalation. This is a networked escalation. And once that threshold is crossed, controlling it becomes exponentially more difficult. Scenario B, contained de-escalation. The ceasefire holds longer than expected. Back-channel negotiations through Qatar, Egypt, and potentially other intermediaries begin to solidify terms. Limited concessions are made. Confidence-building measures are introduced. Both sides reduce immediate pressure points without fundamentally resolving the underlying conflict. On the surface, stability returns. Shipping lanes reopen gradually. Markets stabilize. Headlines shift. But beneath that surface, the infrastructure of coordination remains intact. The alliances are unchanged. The capabilities are still in place. This is not resolution. It is suspension. And that means the next cycle of escalation becomes a question of timing, not possibility. Now here is the reality. Both scenarios are plausible. Both are already in motion at different levels. Which one becomes dominant depends on decisions being made right now, in command centers, in diplomatic channels, in rooms the public will never see. And the clock is ticking. The next 72 hours will be decisive. Will the ceasefire hold under pressure? Will coordination between multiple fronts intensify? Will external powers step in or step back? Those answers are coming fast, and they will determine whether this moment is remembered as a pause or the beginning of something much larger. And that brings us to the final step, pulling all of these pieces together into one clear picture. Let us bring all of these threads together. What began as a series of rapid escalations, Israeli airstrikes in southern Lebanon, followed by large-scale Hezbollah rocket fire, quickly expanded into a multi-front confrontation. Within hours, Houthi forces introduced a maritime dimension, targeting Red Sea corridors and forcing global shipping into crisis mode decisions. A ceasefire was reached, but not in isolation. It came under simultaneous pressure, from the north and from the sea, and was immediately framed by regional actors as a coordinated victory. That framing matters because perception is now shaping strategy as much as firepower. We then followed the consequences. Economic shockwaves moving through global trade routes. Rising costs that reach directly into your daily life. A model of synchronized pressure that challenges traditional military assumptions. And a battlefield that is no longer defined by geography, but by timing and coordination. We examined the military reality, layered defenses, saturation tactics, asymmetric cost advantages, and the strategic strain of responding to multiple fronts at once. Then we pulled back further: China, global trade, structural vulnerability in critical shipping lanes, a system that depends on stability, now facing persistent disruption. And finally, we looked ahead: two paths, escalation or containment, both active, both fragile. The question is not whether this ceasefire exists. The question is whether it represents control or loss of it. Because if coordination is now the new force multiplier, then what we are witnessing is not just a conflict, it is a shift, and the world has not fully caught up to it yet. That is what we do here at Crisis Reporting. We break down the events shaping our world, clearly, precisely, and in real time, so you are never left trying to catch up after the fact. If you found this analysis valuable, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications, because stories like this are evolving by the hour, and you do not want to miss what comes next. And share this with someone who needs to understand what is really happening beneath the headlines, because the more informed you are, the better prepared you are for what is coming. This is World Crisis Reporting. Stay informed, stay ahead.